Welcome back to my channel. Today I am going to be using my knitting machine. I don't think I've used this very much on the channel, and if I have, I haven't really done much with it. Today I'm going to be making a cowl. I have it all rigged up and ready to go, so let's go ahead and get started. First things first is preparing for cast on. I'll be using this flat-ended paddle that came with the machine. And the cowl I'm making today is going to be 3 paddle lengths wide. Now I'm just making sure that all the little hooks are facing the right direction. And I'm going to prepare for casting on. So I crochet the first row on. So I loop the first hook and then everything else gets crocheted on so that string goes right over the top of each hook, and then I pull a loop through the bottom. And then just go down the whole row doing that all the way across. There are several ways that you can cast on without crocheting. One of them I've seen is just looping the string by hand, but I find it doesn't stay on very well, and I like the look of the crocheted first row better anyway. The final hook gets, instead of looped over with the string, I'm just putting the last loop from my hand crochet hook onto the machine hook. And then from there I can just hook on the end of the yarn here onto the carriage. This step took me forever to figure out how important it was, but it's hanging the weights on your work to pull everything down. If you don't hang any weights, then everything gets bunched up and you're going to be dropping a lot of stitches. So first you put these combs on, and then I try to hook the heaviest weights possible that I can on my work to make sure everything's getting pulled down. Unfortunately, I lost the video file that had me pushing the first few rows across, but I just did straight stitches. Now I'm preparing to do the pattern, because I'm going to give this knitted fabric a little bit of texture here. So I'm just making the final adjustments on the carriage and using the 1x3 paddle that I have and adjusting my counter, because I know that this work has to be 230 stitch lengths long, or passes with the carriage long. Now I'm just making sure I have the right yarn tension and settings on the carriage. From here, I just pull it over 4 times back and forth, and it's going to stitch all of the hooks that are pushed back towards the back. So our position A is the very back of the carriage, and position B are those ones that are sticking just a little bit forward from that, and then position D is all the way forward towards me. Here I dropped a couple stitches and I just need to fix that so you can see how easy that is if you run into any problems. So after going back and forth 4 times, I changed the settings from the carriage from a 2 to a 1 on the very front, and that'll push everything back and catch all of those stitches and hooks. So you can see here we're getting a little bit of a pattern, and I alternate which hooks I'm pushing forward every row that I do, so it gives that alternating pattern look. Otherwise it would not look that way if I just kept pulling the same hooks forward every time. I have the speed set to times 10, so this is actually going 10 times faster than what I'm working. Even still, this whole piece took me about an hour and a half to make, and it's gotten to the point where it's long enough to touch the ground, so I have to take those weights off and move them up to the top. That way they continue to pull down on my work. I got a little overconfident in how much yarn I had left and ended up running out before changing it over. So what I should have done is not knitted that row. So I'm back stitching a little bit rehooking those drop stitches back on the hooks, and then continuing on with a new skein of yarn tied onto the old skein. And I'm making sure that I'm leaving that knot to the back of the work. And the back of the work is what's facing me right now, and the front of the work is what's facing away underneath the table. Now, if you were knitting a blanket, you'd want to make sure that those are tucked in well into the work and sew those in. But since I'm going to be sewing on a backing of Sherpa fabric to this, everything, any kind of mistakes, I'll get pulled to the back. That way you can't see it in the main work when it gets done. I'm now getting to the last few rows of knitting this cowl, so I'm going to change my settings and pull the carriage across 4 times, knitting 4 rows without the pattern. I wouldn't say it's necessary to do that, but it makes it easier for me sewing later. And now I can just cast off, and again, I'm just using a crochet hook to crochet those ends in. And what I'm doing to make this nice and stretchy is crocheting a single stitch in between each loop that I'm pulling off the machine to give it a little bit extra room. Otherwise, that's going to pull the ends very tight, and it's going to look a little funny when I go to sew it later. Off camera, I also made a matching headband to go with, so you'll see that getting pinned on this Sherpa fabric. Make sure you're leaving a 1/2 inch seam allowance when you cut the Sherpa fabric from the cowl itself. It'll make it easier for sewing later if you have a little bit of extra stuff to work with. Otherwise, you're going to be sewing just the Sherpa fluff instead of the actual fabric woven or knitted base. I'm not sure what Sherpa is, if it's knitted or woven actually. So for the headband piece, you will just sew the long ends and do not sew anything on the short ends, because we'll need those to be able to turn the work through. And again, leave a little bit of seam allowance for that Sherpa fabric, so then you're not sewing just the fluff. I'm also using a zigzag stitch to make sure I'm getting as much of that yarn in there as possible and not just getting like a stitch here and there and that it'll pull apart easily. The yarn that I'm using is pretty, I don't want to say thin, but it deteriorates pretty quickly into roving again. So now I'm sewing onto the main cowl, and this one you can sew the 3 ends, and then on that 4th end you can leave a small-ish hole for you to pull the work through. So you can see I'm sewing all 4 corners and going down a little bit, skipping a little space to be able to pull through, and here we are. Here, I'm just going to sew up that end where I pulled my work through on the cowl. And the headband's going to be a little bit different than the cowl, so I'm going to sew that Sherpa fabric together, putting the right sides together. Once that's sewed together, I can then take a tapestry needle and some yarn and sew the yarn ends, that outside end, together. And I wasn't paying attention to where I had my camera and my work, so you can see me slowly raising everything up to make sure that the camera can see it. I know I didn't lay it out well here, but what I'm going to be doing is taking the left side of the cowl, the bottom right corner is going to get sewn on to the right side of the cowl on the side edge, making the very left corner of the cowl meet up with the left corner of the right side of the cowl. And then just tying that off there. And once that's done, we have a finished scarf. This one was actually made for a friend, so I won't be trying on this particular scarf to show you. But this is what mine looks like when it's on, so I really like it because you don't have to tie a scarf. It's super thick around the neck, and it tucks in nicely into your jacket without having a whole bunch of other scarf laying around. So if you like this video and want to see more of what I do, hit that like and subscribe button, and thanks for watching!